Good morning. We are on Memhei Amud Aleph, 45a, third to last line. Actually, fourth to last line's the last two words. So let's just collect the conclusions we have, because that's going to be necessary as we go forward. Conclusion number one is our Mishnah, which states that a corpse that is concealed, it's under a mound of rocks or it's buried, does not qualify as a corpse that would require the egla rufa. Conclusion number one. Conclusion number two is that the same scenario by shikha, a sheaf that's forgotten, buried beneath the ground, is a dispute. Conclusion number two. Now, conclusion number three is we have an unresolved issue, which is that a sheaf that's floating, we don't know if it constitutes shikha or not. Or in other words, we aren't sure of whether the airspace of a field is considered as if it's on the actual ground of the field itself. That's the three conclusions we have. So the Gemara is going to do now is introduce a situation in which you have a airspace with regard to a corpse.
Okay, so now we're tying it to the
We're bringing it back to the Egla Rufa. And the airspace in regard to a corpse, as well as a unique feature of concealment in the case of the Egla Rufa. Even though Mishnah concluded that a buried corpse does not qualify as Egla Rufa, but the Gemara is going to discuss a unique case. This is where we are. Yeah? Okay. Omar Abaye said, this is a little interesting introduction that gives us a window into the personalities of the Gemara, the personalities of the sages. Abaye said, Abaye lives in Pumpadisa, Pumpadisa being one of the big Jewish centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia. Abaye is towards the end of the era of the Gemara. Okay? I'm saying this because it's going to be kind of relevant for the little anecdote here. So Abaye said, Hareini ke ben Azai shuk Tveria. At the moment, I feel like Ben Azai in the marketplaces of Tveria. So he's standing in the marketplace of Pumpadisa in Babylonia over a century, perhaps even more, perhaps even two, after Ben Azai. Ben Azai lives in the times of Rabbi Akiva. Right? He married Rabbi Akiva's daughter, actually. So that's in the directly post-destruction era. Rabbi Akiva is right there during Bar Kokhba's revolt. So he's there during the post-destruction era. Ben Azai is a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, younger. Right? He married his daughter, or he was going to marry his daughter, right? The Gemara says that the same thing Rabbi Akiva did to his wife, marrying and then going to learn, Ben Azai did to Rabbi Akiva's wife, to Rabbi Akiva's daughter. Right, if I remember correctly. Either, right, the Gemara discusses whether he actually got married or if he got married didn't consummate. This is all ringing bells. I didn't look it up, but this is all from memory. Mm-hmm. There's a relation there between Ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva's daughter. Yeah, right, Ben Azai is one of the people who entered into the Pardes, he's one of the four who entered with Rabbi Akiva into the spiritual realm, and he's the one that didn't come out. He died in ecstasy in this, right? Rabbi Akiva's the only one who, right? Remember the story? Rabbi Akiva went in with three others into Latile of the Pardes. Literally means to stroll in the garden. Which Pardes means a garden, literally, but it means the garden of Torah. So they went into some mystical experience. And Akiva gives them specific instructions. When you get there and you see Avnei Shayish and you see marble stones, you shouldn't say Mayim Mayim, you shouldn't say water, water. Whatever that means, it's a mystical kind of story. And they go in. One comes out and has a mental breakdown of sorts. One abandons Judaism. I think that was Acher. Elisha ben Avuya. He's Acher. He's the one that abandoned Judaism. And then the last one, Ben Azai, he died in ecstasy. He didn't come out. Akiva is the only one who entered in peace and came back in peace. Can Google it probably. Before we strolled in Paradise, Rabbi Akiva. I'm sure it'll come up if I Google it. Yeah, before entered, they ascended to heaven. Yep. Ben Azai, Ben Zayman, Acher, Elisha ben Avuya. Yeah, this is the story. The Gemara tells a story, and the Zohar tells a story.
So physically they went up? Or is it just a spiritual?
I can't, it seems to me to be a mystical experience.
Like the Baal Shem Tov.
That's something like of that nature, yeah. It's one of the earliest recorded mystical experiences. There are others, Yechid ben Zakkai, which comes even earlier. At any rate, so this is Ben Azai. And Ben Azai, his name was Shimon, actually, but is only referred to by his suffix, son of Azai, because he never actually got smicha, never actually got ordained. He died too young, considering this incident. So they don't want to call him Shimon, because if they call him Shimon, it's going to be disrespectful because they're not putting Rabbi before. So they just put Ben Azai. This is one of the explanations for why he's called Ben Azai rather than by his actual name. I think it's in the Bar Tanuda on the Mishnah in Avos. Ben Azai speaks there, Bar Tanuda, if I'm not mistaken, it describes there different reasons why it's called Ben Azai. And Ben Azai, sorry?
Sorry, is that similar to Abaye?
So 1 second. Abaye did get married.
No, but I mean, it's not having the prefix.
Oh, Abaye this is by the nickname of his stepmother gave him, his adopted mother gave him. Abaye, if I'm not mistaken, Abaye is called Abaye because that's the nickname of his adopted mother, if I remember correctly. Anyway, they each have interesting stories, and it'd be interesting to see why Abaye specifically says I'm like Ben Azai, but just the main point of the story here. So, where was I? Oh, Ben Azai is one who is the model of Nafshi Chachshka B'Torah. He's so deeply lusted for Torah, we're using the word lust specifically, that he didn't have to get married. Even though I mentioned before that he married Rabbi Akiva's daughter, but it was never like consummated. He got married and he left her to go learn, and then died in this mystical experience. Because the Rambam writes that the only person who's exempt from marriage is someone who has a deep lust for Torah like Ben Azai. He's the model for someone who is allowed to completely dissociate from materialistic pursuits in their pursuit of holy Torah, which is why he died in ecstasy. He just let go, went into this mystical experience. Shimon Yochai married though.
Well, he preached that.
So he detached from it. That's right. He did. To which the Gemara says many tried like him, it didn't work out. Right, but for Ben Azai, it did work out. Okay. That's right. So Ben Azai, considering his life completely absorbed in Torah, he can sit in the marketplaces of Tveria, not be distracted, and teach. So Abaye says, on this one particular day, his mind is feeling clear. Actually, said Daita Tzlula. His mind is feeling clear. So he's in the marketplaces of Pumbedis and says, I feel like Ben Azai right now. Anybody who wants to come and ask me a question. That's essentially what happened. That's what the Gemara is telling us here. It's kind of incident, gives us a little window. You pick up these little incidents from the Gemara and you can paint a picture of these personalities. And a good place to look is, I think we talked about this book before. Yeah.
The introduction to the.
That's right. ArtScroll's beautiful new introduction to the Talmud, full book that's just an introduction. And in it, it goes through each sage and gives you a brief bio.
You're not getting paid to make that endorsement.
I am not getting paid to make that endorsement, but I'm currently learning it and I'm really enjoying it. I have a book actually at home, produced by Moshe Rav Cook, which is the whole thing is just on Rabbi Akiva, on his story, his personality, his thinking. I'm sorry. Yeah, have a look at that. It's worthwhile getting and reading.
Have it at, interestingly enough, have it at par day.
I'm sure they have it at Pardes. They do? You got it?
I didn't get it yet.
But you saw it there.
I called them.
They have it.
They have.
Yeah.
I guess I've been talking about par day.
Yeah. Also not a paid endorsement, but there's a wonderful store Pardes. If they don't have the book you're looking for, they will order it for you. And for Canadian prices, they're reasonable.
Maybe they'll give me a discount for mentioning it on your.
Tell them that, yeah. See if that'll work.
I'll show them the video.
At any rate, so these little tidbits from the Gemara, even though it seems quote unquote incidental, nothing in the Gemara is incidental. So first of all, it gives you a window into their personalities, which itself is interesting, especially if you're historically inclined, as I enjoy that. But also, on a deeper level, I'm sure, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure that the Gemara's question that's about to follow, considering that Abaye's made this announcement, I feel like Ben Azai in the market, come asking whatever you want. So someone approached him with a question. I'm sure the question is connected to the incident and not just in the fact that it happened to have happened then. Because the Gemara could have just as well said, someone asked Abaye, not telling us this background that he's in the market and he feels like Ben Azai. The fact that the Gemara did give us means there's some sort of deeper connection. I don't know what that is, but I'm sure that it exists. Okay. So Omar Abaye said, third to last line of the page, I feel like Ben Azai, or not I feel, I am currently like Ben Azai in the markets of Tveria, who are oblivious to surrounding Katish Torah. So I, Abaye, feel that way right now. So I'm standing in the market of Pumbedisa. Whoever wants, come ask me your questions. My mind is clear and I feel that way. So Amar Le, Hauma Rabbana. So one of the sages came and asked him the following. La Abaye to Abaye, taking the opportunity. So these are the questions that are bothering the sages. He's given the opportunity to ask Abaye whatever he wants, and this is what he asks. Shnei chalalim, if we have two corpses, zeh agave zeh, one stacked upon the other. So instead of finding one unresolved murder, they find two unresolved murders. And one corpse is lying on top of the other. But it's not directly on top of the other. They're staggered somewhat. So one corpse protrude from the other. Yeah. And therefore, the distance you measure from one versus the other would be different. And let's say it's exactly at the 50% mark between one city and another, in that one corpse is 49% closer to one city, and the other corpse is 49% closer to another city. So Mehechan Humoided, from which would you measure? If you measure from one, you're going to one city. You measure from the other, you're going to another city.
So like this.
That's right. That's why I said they're staggered.
Yeah.
Not staggered. That's the right word. Staggered.
Yeah, that's the right word.
That's the right word. Yeah. So they're like exactly. They're one like this. So depending on which one you measure from, and they're really right at the middle point. So one's closer by a couple of feet or a couple of inches to this city, and that one's a couple of inches closer to that city. So this is obviously a hypothetical that would be, if the whole Algar Rufa is rare, this is certainly rare. Right? But as we learn in chapter 5 of Tanya, the author explains the virtue of learning Torah. This is something we have to remind ourselves, even as we learn, and certainly before we begin learning, that the objective of learning Torah is to bind our minds with the mind of Hashem. And therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, when you're learning Gemara, right, secular law is emergent, meaning to say, what does society need to function, and we'll make laws accordingly. It's emergent from society. Right? So I don't know, maybe there still are laws in the books about how you drive your horse and cattle on the street, but I doubt they exist anymore. If they exist, they're completely obsolete. No one's studying them. Because what's the point? It's emergent. It's not relevant. It's only relevant. It's only a question of what's relevant in society, and then we make laws accordingly. But Torah law is not that way. Torah law is from above to below. It's Hashem's thinking that if such and such were to happen, such and such is the law.
Doesn't become obsolete.
It doesn't become obsolete. That's never going to happen. irrelevant. It's not a question of learning laws that are relevant for life. It's a question of binding our minds with Hashem's thinking.
Or whether the probability of outcome is
Exactly.
extremely remote. Doesn't make any difference.
That's correct. That's what the writes in chapter 5, that even if these cases never exist, doesn't make a difference. In the moment of understanding this and breaking my mind to understand as best I can, I'm breaking my mind to understand Hashem's thinking. And that's the objective.
Expansion.
That's right. And the Alter explains there in great detail how that union through learning Torah is deeper than any other union. Because the ideas of Hashem are inside your mind, so it's inside you. And while you're learning, your mind is in it. So you're wrapped in it, and it's wrapped in you. As opposed to, say, mitzvahs, which you only engage in. So you're wrapped in the mitzvah. But here, you're wrapped in the learning, and the learning is wrapped in you. Because you're ingesting it. Especially if you internalize it, and it informs the way you think, then you've really internalized Hashem's thinking.
You mentioned it.
Yeah, it's something we have to remind ourselves all the time, because it's what that's the objective here. It's Hashem's Torah. It's not just for the fun, God forbid. Okay, so this is this hypothetical that's probably never happened of two corpses, one on top of the other, staggered. And which one do we measure from? Because measuring from one would lead us to one city, and measuring from the other would lead us to another city.
And it's interesting, the one on top has an overhang, and the one below. So there's an issue of
The floating.
floating.
So now we have two issues here.
Right.
We have the issue of the one below. Is it considered buried? Because there's another corpse on top of it. And therefore, is it disqualified from Egla Rufa? Because it's buried.
Right.
Number one. Number two, is the one on top considered floating? And it's disqualified from Egla Rufa. So they're both disqualified. Is one disqualified? Or are neither disqualified?
And the third is the measuring.
Right. So, well, that's the question. Which one is
Right.
qualified? Which one is disqualified? So are they both disqualified because one is floating and one is buried? Are they both valid because it's not buried and not floating? Is one valid because floating is not an issue, but buried is an issue? Or is the other one valid because burying is not an issue and floating is the issue? So we have four different possible outcomes, both neither or top or below. And the Gemara is going to go through each of these scenarios and explain what the thinking would be in each of these possible outcomes. So let's see, what are the sides of the coin? Okay. Question one is, with respect to the one below, min bin minoi have tamun, when one substance is buried under the same very substance. So in this case, it's a corpse buried beneath another corpse. Is that considered buried?
Like
Or is
sheets
buried
under other sheets.
So that's the Gemara Abai is going to introduce that as a possible resolution. Let's get the thinking before we get to the resolution. Is one thing, but no, look at this. Is the earth buried under the earth? No, it just is the earth. It's not buried under the earth. Yes, there is some layers of the earth buried beneath other layers of the earth. But because they're one substance, you don't consider one buried in the other. It just is. It's what, right?
Right.
That's min biminoi. The substance buried within its own substance
Is not buried.
is not. So the Gemara's first suggestion is it is considered buried. Okay, but the other side of the coin is it's not considered buried. In this case, in this scenario, it is considered buried. And therefore the one below is disqualified from Egla Rufa because it's buried. Yeah. Min biminoi, when you have one thing on top of another, lo yahav it's not considered floating. Just like the earth, the top layer of the earth is not considered floating above the lower layers of the earth. It's the earth. So the upper body, the upper corpse, the higher corpse, is not considered floating because it's just on another corpse. So the buried one, the one below is considered buried. The one on top is not considered floating.
Why would the one that's considered?
This is one way of thinking about it.
Right.
Again, you can think about.
You would think they would have the same logic.
We're going to together. That's what I said. You have four options.
No.
Either neither of them qualify because it's considered buried and it's considered flowing. Both of them are qualified because it's not considered buried, it's not considered floating. The only upper one is qualified because it's considered buried but not considered floating, or only the bottom one is qualified because it is considered floating but not considered buried. We're going to each of these scenarios. So they don't have to be consistent because the rules of burying doesn't have to be the same thing as the rules of floating.
even though they use the same premise.
Even though they use the same premise.
Using the same substance.
Yeah, because perhaps the same substance is only an issue to disqualify burying, but not to disqualify floating, or perhaps only to disqualify quote floating, but not to disqualify buried. Always, right? So let's go through each. Following?
Yeah,
you would think they're consistent, but they don't necessarily have to be.
Yeah, no,
because
I understand the whole
that's why I began. That's why I began with this introduction, because we already know. We know that when it comes to Egla Rufa, buried is disqualified. When it comes to sheaves, dispute, right? And when it comes to floating, we're unresolved. So it's not so simple to say that they have to be the same, right? So let's go through all the scenarios then, right? See, they don't have to be consistent necessarily because we see the laws are different in each. That's right. There you go. So let's see again. So possibility number one is bin bin minoy habatamun. One substance buried in another substance is considered buried, and therefore the bottom one is disqualified because it's buried beneath the corpse. Umin bin minoy, but one substance on top of another substance of the same substance, loyav itself is not considered floating because it's on the same substance, and therefore me'alyan moided, you would measure from the top one. This seems to be the halacha. How do I know that? Look at the page, you should get the answer. How do I know that? How do I know that this seems to be the halacha? Look at the words. There's see the little chaf there?
Yeah.
Remember, that's the citation to the halachic ruling. This is the only time of the 4 different outcomes that the Gemara presents. This is the only time where you'll see the citation. So this would be my clue that the halacha is you measure from the top.
Where do you find that? The chaf on the left?
Here, up here. Ein mishpat ner mitzvah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that's possible ruling number one. That it is considered buried, but not considered floating. And therefore you measure from the top.
Sorry.
It'd be the chaf right here at the bottom. So it says there Maimonides. Maimonides means Rambam, Maimonides.
Yeah.
Perek Tesh, chapter 9. Mehilchas Retzeach. The laws of murder, halacha yud, subsection halacha number 10. That's what you're going to find in chapter 10, subsection 9. 9 on 10, whatever. Okay, so that's possibility number one. It is considered buried, but not considered floating, and thus you measure from the top one. Or perhaps reverse. Min bin minnoy havatzaf. The top one is considered floating, even though it's on top of the same substance. But min bin minnoy lo yavatamun. But the one below is not considered buried because it's under its own substance. And therefore, if it is considered floating and not considered buried, mitachton moeded, you measure from the bottom one. Or perhaps, third possibility, min bin, keep them consistent. Min bin minnoy havatamun. The lower one is considered buried. Min bin minnoy havatzaf. And the top one is considered floating because they're both on top of this. They're on top and under the same substance, and therefore it's not considered buried. Sorry, and therefore it is considered buried and it is considered floating. And if it is buried and it's floating, what would you do? Don't measure from either. You don't measure from the bottom below. And you don't measure from the one above.
Are we concluding at this point that floating is disqualified?
Sorry?
Are we concluding that floating is disqualified? Because yesterday we knew, as you said today, floating is unresolved.
On the issue of sheaths.
The issue of sheaths.
But on the issue of corpses, we already said in the Mishnah that if it's hanging, it has to be on the ground. Right? The Mishnah said that if it's buried or if it's hanging, it's not qualified.
Okay, right. Okay.
Right?
Only
Actually, now I noticed the Gemara does not give the fourth option. Did the Gemara give the fourth option? No. The Gemara did not give the option that you measure from both. Why would that be? Let's think for a second. Why wouldn't the Gemara say you measure from both? The Gemara doesn't give the fourth one. Well, why not say that it's not considered buried and it's not considered floating? And therefore they're both to be measured from both. Actually, Rashi says the Gemara could have done that. It just doesn't specify it because it's self-understood considering the other 3 options. That's what Rashi says.
How would you measure?
The last Rashi. Who had in? It could have also been the Maboyle Nami that it could have asked, that it's not considered buried and not considered floating. And you measure from both. But it's already incorporated in the first 3 options. It's self-understood from the first 3 options. So Rashi is learning that there is 4 possibilities. Okay, yeah.
I understand that.
Sorry?
I'm not sure I understand that. Because if you would were to take the fourth case.
which is what? Spell it out.
It's neither one applies.
That was the third one. That's the one the Gemara specified. The Gemara only specified three options.
They're both.
Option 4 is they're both valid. Measure from both.
Right, they're both valid. So.
And then have two different egla roofa, one foot. Measure from both. And this city takes care of that egla roofa, and that city takes care of that egla roofa, because they're both valid.
That's okay. That's
Yeah.
how it would work. Okay.
Why not? If they're both valid,
that would make sense.
that's right. If they're both valid, then measure to whichever city's closer. And if elders from both cities, so then two cities have to do that egla roofa. So be it. Two different mitzvahs. What's the issue? Okay, so but Rashi, even though the Gemara doesn't specify that, Rashi says we can throw that in there as well. Okay, so this is the question that posed to Abaye when his mind is feeling clear. Think about this. Imagine a sage came to you and said, a sage like Abaye, someone who is an author in the Gemara, comes to you and says, my mind is feeling good, ask me whatever you want. Is this the thing that would bother you?
Yes.
Why? Because you and I are not such tzaddikim. And figuring out God's Torah is not as important as, I don't know, what's my purpose in life or something. You know, like what should I do, or some other question that's pertinent on a personal level. But for these sages, their whole world is Torah. Now I have opportunity to understand Hashem's knowledge more. Let me get it. It's incredible.
Now we can sleep easy.
Now we can finally know the answer to this unresolved murder, double unresolved murder, double homicide. It's incredible. Okay, so Amar Le, so Abaye responded to the sage who came to this important question. He said, top of Memhei Amadeus 45. She said, I cannot tell you the answer to the question of floating, because that remained unresolved. Right?
Well, in the sheet.
That's right. So one substance on top of another substance, we never resolved the floating issue.
That's sort of my question before, yeah.
Floating literally, words hanging from the tree. The Mishnah already told us it's disqualified from egla roofa. Right?
Right.
That we already disqualified.
Yeah.
But one substance on top of another, the same substance, we have not resolved it, not in egla roofa, nor did we resolve it on the question of sheaves either. So we have no premise. But with respect to buried one under the other, at least with respect to sheaves, we have the answer. We have the answer. It's a dispute. Right?
Yeah.
Now, Rashi actually tells us that even with respect to the sheaves, we don't have, with respect to the sheaves, we don't have the answer resolved about floating. Right.
Wait, what's the difference between having a dispute and not having an answer? Isn't that
Okay,
thing?
not necessarily, because you have a dispute, that means you know there are people who think this way and people think that way, and then you apply the halachic rules of follow the majority.
Okay.
Right? So you have what to do. But if nobody has an opinion, you're left with.
Okay, right. It's unresolved.
That's right.
That's what unresolved.
Exactly, unresolved as in we have no authoritative view. That's right. So we have no authoritative view one way or the other about a substance floating on top of another substance that's the same. Right? Because the Mishnah, which said that the top sheaf, everybody agrees, is not part of the law of shikha, wasn't because of floating, but because the guy took it to go to the market.
That's right. Because
so we have no resolution with regard to the top one, but we do have a resolution with respect to the bottom one. It's a dispute, whether it's considered buried or not. So we'll apply that here. That's what Abaye is about to tell us. So the lower corpse, we have a dispute whether it can be counted. And if we have a dispute, at least that's the Gemara's suggestion at the moment. The Gemara is going to change that up a little bit. But if we have a dispute, then follow the majority opinion.
You can derive a
halachic ruling accordingly, according to the principles of how you resolve disputes.
Right.
There are also halachic principles of how you resolve unresolved issues, but they aren't necessarily the same as how you resolve disputes.
Right. You can't look to a majority.
That's right. You can't look to a majority here. So you have to rely on other things like, do you go with that which is more stringent? Do you go with that more lenient? What would be the stringency? What would be the leniency? These are the kinds of questions you would have when you have a unresolved question. When you have a dispute, you have other principles that you rely on. Like, for example, if you go with the latter generations, the one that's more recent, you go with the most recent majority. That would be a way of putting it. That doesn't necessarily, you don't have those principles when you're talking about an unresolved question.
How would that work?
In this case,
they would have to deliberate on that. issue and
Yeah.
make. And
A
vote
Bedouin
on
would have to look for precedent.
and vote.
They'd look for precedent, yeah. This
And
goes on
use
till
those derivate principles.
yeah,
in order to
it goes
come with a-
it goes on till this very day. Classic example I like to use is there's a few different examples you can use, but one of the easy ones is riding a bike on Shabbos. When bikes were first invented and became popularized, there was the very minority view that allowed for it to be used on Shabbos. Because really, what's the issue? What's the actual issue of the bike on Shabbos?
maybe if it
Let's say
breaks,
assuming it's an Erev. That's a
fix
maybe.
it.
Do we have the authority to impose such a prohibition on a maybe? On a maybe. Maybe it's going to break and maybe you'll fix it.
Like an instrument, musical instrument.
Okay, so when you have a precedent where the sages put a ban on something because of a maybe, okay, so you got to go with that. But who said we have the authority to do that? So there was a minority opinion that said you're allowed. Majority of opinion said no. And then they came up with all kinds of reasons. Like, for example, that might break. You might drive in the mud, in which case, if you're making like a charetz, you're making a dent in the ground. When is that a problem? Anyways, also a question. Because it goes so fast, you might end up out of the borders of your city. You may carry all kinds of maybes. Yeah. So the bottom line is, as Rabbi Avadia Yosef puts it, he goes, it's memory again, but he says, he goes through it and explains why all the reasons, he's not so thrilled with all the reasons that they came to prohibit it. Yeah. And in fact, if I remember correctly, it was the Ben Ish Chai who permitted it, or the Chida. Don't remember. What's the same? Ben Ish Chai is the same person, doesn't it? Maybe it's the same person. Look this up. Ben Ish Chai. Sorry? Yeah, he's a Chida. Yeah, the same person. He's Chaim of Baghdad. Yeah. And anyway, if I'm not mistaken, it was him who said you're allowed to ride a bike. Yeah, Chaim Yosef David Azulai, it's the Chida. Right? And didn't he write? Didn't he write the Ben Ish Chai? I think maybe not. Maybe it is a different person. It's one of the leading Sephardic authorities, that I can tell you. Yosef Chaim. No, it's not the same person. No, it's not the same person.
But he ruled, whoever it was, ruled that it's okay.
It's okay to ride a bike. Maybe it is the same person. The other one was Yosef Chaim David Azulai. So there's a David. There's a Dalet in there. This one doesn't have a Dalet. Yosef Chaim doesn't have a David. Right? I'm so bad at this stuff. Anyway, there's one of them who said it's permitted to ride a bike on Shabbos. But Rabbi Avadia Yosef concludes, look, even if I can't like substantiate each of the claims for the prohibition, considering the fact that collectively they all came to the conclusion that it's forbidden, I'm going to forbid it too.
Is it like a gezerah?
It's not a gezerah, it's a majority. It's the halachic ruling. In other words, we believe that Hashem's involvement in our halachic rulings is active. And that if the sages all came to a conclusion, the majority opinion came to a conclusion, this is what Hashem wants. So I can reason my way from today till tomorrow, makes a difference. Hashem wants us to follow this. Right? So that's kind of what Rabbi Yosef is saying. If I go through point by point, I can tell you why the bike is okay. But they all came to the conclusion it's forbidden. And thus it's forbidden. That's kind of the thinking. Anyway, okay, let's conclude. Let's finish a little bit. Let's learn the original resolution. Tanitua Abaye responds and says, look, I can't tell you about the floating issue, but I could tell you about the buried issue, the issue of the buried. And that's been taught to us. That a person picked up to carry out, you want to take it to the city, so he already acquired it. And then
It's not the buried one, that's the floating one.
But the floating one's unresolved, right? Because the reason why it's not qualified is because he took it, not because of the floating. right? He took it. He took one and started taking it to the city. And he placed it on top of another sheaf. And he forgot both of them. The one below is considered forgotten, i.e., it is not considered buried, even though it's under another sheaf. In the top one, is not part of the law of shikha. Why? Because I already took it out to take it. Rabbi Shimon, son of Yehuda, says, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Shneim Ein Shikha. Then neither of them are shikha. Hatacht in the lower one, Pneshu Talmud, because it's considered buried. So the first say, Tanakama says, the sages say the bottom one is not considered buried, and therefore it is part of shikha. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says it is considered buried, and therefore it's not part of shikha. In the top one, which we learned, means not that it's because it's floating, but because it's as if he never put it down because he's still holding it. So I cannot resolve your issue about the one on top, but I could resolve the issue about the one on the bottom, namely dispute. Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to stop over here, but tomorrow the Gemara is going to dig deeper into, okay, what are they thinking? If we are to, at this point, the way I left it is not completely accurate, as we'll see tomorrow. Because the way I left it now is that the dispute with respect to the sheaves no, yes, I left it accurate. The dispute with respect to the sheaves applies to the same as it does by Egla Rufa. And the Gemara is going to dig into, well, what does this mean? Why is it that you're keeping them consistent? And maybe they shouldn't be consistent. That's the Gemara is going to challenge tomorrow. First, going to establish, well, if you're keeping it consistent, let's see how that would work out. That the dispute that you find by sheaves is the same as the dispute you find by a corpse. What's the thinking behind that? And does that thinking hold up? That's what we're going to do, God willing, tomorrow. Okay, wonderful day, Yidden.